I am happy to have this opportunity to preach in the Brite Chapel today because I have been wishing especially for a pulpit this fall, some worshiping community within which to reflect on the scriptures. For this fall, I have been struck over and over by the sinking feeling that we are living once more in biblical times. And I don't mean that in a good way, not in a let's put on our bathrobes and sandals and pretend we are shepherds in the Judean countryside sort of Bible land way. I mean it in an alarming apocalyptic sort of way, that the atmosphere in which we currently live and work and study is charged with cosmic significance, that national and world events of late sit upon us with a weight of biblical proportions. It is difficult to open up a newspaper or turn on a broadcast without noticing that all creation is groaning. The ice is melting, the coral reefs are dying, Louisiana is sinking, while the false prophets of big oil stand on the street corners telling us to avert our eyes and turn on the gas. Thanks to Dr. Poppy's assistance in making the connection for me, I've been writing lectionary reflections this fall for a preaching website. I have been assigned to write preaching reflections on biblical passages that will be read during the Christmas season. So this fall I am thinking about Christmas and have been writing about the flight to Egypt, Joseph and Mary fleeing from Bethlehem to save their baby Jesus from the wrath of Herod in the refuge of Egypt. And while I am writing about the flight to Egypt, I am thinking of the children in Honduras and Guatemala fleeing for their lives from drug lords in these places, fleeing in fear and desperation, knowing that if Joseph had received the dream to leave his endangered village and take refuge in a foreign country with his family in the global political circumstances similar to our own, he would likely have been turned back. No, he would certainly have been turned back at the border, told to wait it out and hope for the best in Bethlehem. Because yes, the baby Jesus is saved from the wrath of Herod only because he and his family were able to cross a border that is no longer crossable. Or I am writing about John the Baptist, in biblical tradition, the herald of the Messiah, and in Jewish history, more likely a prophet resisting Roman occupation. I am thinking of John the Baptist, his youth and his idealism, called by God to inaugurate the new kingdom, to baptize in the Jordan for the new Exodus. And I am thinking at the same time of the youth and idealism of an American named Peter Kasich, an Iraqi veteran, a veteran of the Iraq War, whom we need with his family to hold in our prayers, who chose to go back to Syria to offer humanitarian assistance to refugees of the Syrian war and who is now a prisoner of ISIL. And I think of his youth and his idealism and his bravery and of John the Baptist, and the faith that is not uncommonly meted out to young idealists who are living in biblical times. And then I turn to the gospel text that has been assigned in the lectionary for the week in which I preached this last Sunday, only to find that this gospel is sizzling and crackling with that same sort of apocalyptic foreboding that has been haunting me all fall. The parable of the vineyard and the tenant speaks to me this week, I am sorry to say, not in the way that I prefer having the gospel lessons speak to me. I prefer having the gospel lections speak to me as the lifeline, the rope that is thrown down into the pit of despair to give a way out of no way. Perhaps those of you in churches where the preachers used the lectionary this past week heard sermons from those who were able to find that lifeline in this parable. But in my apocalyptic mood, I have not been able to read it this way. This Matthean parable seems to echo and underscore the troubled times in which we live without giving us a way out. It is a parable of a householder who has tenants and slaves, and the tenants enact violence on the slaves of the householder, beating and stoning and killing. They do this twice in quick succession to two sets of slaves and then to the son as well. The social system has totally unraveled here. And what is the response to the murder and unraveling of the social system? The owner makes clear that the cycle of vengeance and violence will go forward. The owner of the vineyard will put those miserable wretches to death. The parable lays out the cycle of religious violence in which we are caught up without offering up a lifeline by which we might break the cycle. Perhaps the good news of the parable, the hard good news of this parable, is that it requires us to own the problem, requires us to recognize that if we are called to answer the violence of this world with the love and mercy that is part of our biblical tradition, and we are certainly called to do that, but we must also then remember that our scriptures are not just part of the solution to religious violence, they are also part of the problem. We must be clear-eyed about this. Our Matthean parable today offers the message that violence will be met by violence. Ruthless killing by ruthless killing. You kill my son, I will crush you on this cornerstone. This is not the Quran, people. This is not other people's religion. This is not the Old Testament God, a story from the book of Joshua that accidentally fell out of place in our New Testament gospel of mercy and love, as the Christian descendants of Marcion might like to say. This is the reading from the Gospel of Matthew, and we are called to own this parable today, to wrestle with it, but also to resist it, to find another way out of the pit of despair than to clamp down on the message that if your people kill my people, my God will kill you. We've got to find another lifeline, another way out. And thus, I'm happy to say this morning we might find our way out through another scripture that was part of this past Sunday's lectionary, the reading today from Paul's epistle to the Philippians. I must confess that I am not predisposed to find my gospel in Paul's epistles. Let us just say that this apostle to the Gentiles and I have had our disagreements. One of the things that Paul and I have quarreled about is his apparent arrogance, the self-assertion and confidence he so often expresses in his letters that seems absent of a certain humility we'd like to see in our spiritual leaders. And here he goes again in our lection for today. If anyone has reason to be confident in the flesh, I have more. Recalling for us he is a member of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew, born of the Hebrews, as to righteousness under the law, blameless. It is a signature trait of the Apostle Paul to remind his readers of his estimable status, and sometimes in the middle of what can ring to our own ears as a false humility. There are many examples, but for one, consider Corinth. In Corinth, he scolds the Corinthians that they are fighting about something as irrelevant as who baptized whom. Stop fighting about who baptized you, he said. It's irrelevant. It doesn't matter. I thank God, he writes, I baptized none of you. Except, and then here comes the except I did baptize Crispus and Gaius. And now that I think about it, I also baptized the household of Stephanus. Right? Stop fighting about baptism. It doesn't matter who baptized who, but also for the record, let me remind you that I was the one who baptized Crispus. Or again in Corinth, with respect to tongue speaking, he writes to say tongue speaking, quite low on the ranking of spiritual gifts. Tone down your enthusiasm. Tone it down. It's not that special. It makes outsiders think you're mad. But by the way, when it comes to tongue speaking, I thank God I speak in tongues more than all of you. It's so predictable, this religious confidence Paul has, bordering, some might think, on spiritual arrogance. And here we have in the letter to the Philippians, I'm of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of the Hebrews. This is in any case, was my first thinking as I took up this passage from Paul's letter to the Philippians. But then I began reading Paul's letter to the Philippians while thinking about Ferguson, Missouri, about Michael Brown, about the sorry circumstance that an unarmed black teenager pulled over by the policeman for nothing more than the suspicion of jaywalking ends up dead on that sidewalk. I'm thinking about his body lying there in the sun for 4 hours and what that says about a breakdown of civilization in the heartland of the United States of America, and what to make of the images, the apocalyptic images of the riot gear brought out by that police force in subsequent days, the tanks and the military assault weapons and the tear gas, and as Dr. Will Gaffney tweeted in those times, the fact that citizens of Gaza were advising citizens of Ferguson, Missouri about how to cope with tear gas spray from officers in military uniforms. And in the weeks since Michael Brown's death, I've been observing the polling data about how divided white people and black people are in this country about the issue of racism, about institutional racism, about systemic racism in policing and housing and banking practices, to name a few sites of contention. With respect to crime, for instance, here are these findings reported by the New York Times columnist Charles Blow. White people are more punitive than blacks and Hispanics, even though they experience less crime. White Americans overestimate the proportion of crime committed by people of color and associate people of color with criminality. With respect specifically to the death of Michael Brown, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch reported a survey on September 15th which had the following findings. While 65% of African-American county residents believe Ferguson police officer Darren Wilson acted unjustly when he ended Brown's life, 62% of white residents surveyed by Remington believe the shooting death of Michael Brown was justified. When surveyors asked if Wilson should be arrested and charged with a crime, 71% of African-American residents responded yes, opposed to 71% of white survey takers who believe the police officer should not be arrested or charged. More could be said, of course. But what these statistics and the many more statistics like these that could be pulled up suggest to me is that we white people, and here I'm doing the Apostle Paul thing, right? In Romans, I am speaking to you Gentiles. I am speaking to you white people. We white people who are leaders of churches engaged in teaching ministry in largely white congregations who, if polled, would likely respond in similar ways, we have some work to do. We've got some work to do, some teaching to do about the matter of race in these United States and the matter of white privilege. This will be hard work because talking about race in America with white people is hard for many complicated reasons, among which surely is the panicky feeling white people in churches might have that if their ministers start talking about white privilege, they might ignore the many sorrows, the many hurts of their congregation that need to be addressed in their own right. The illnesses, the terminal cancers, the broken families, the financial hardships. White people in our predominantly and exclusively white congregations have their own sorrows that their ministers and church leaders need to tend to. And the fear in white churches that ministers bringing up issues of systemic racism might be diverting attention from their own sorrows is certainly one of the complicated reasons that many in these churches might not want this conversation. But still, it seems to me we who are leaders and teachers in exclusively or predominantly white congregations need to press for this conversation in these apocalyptic times. To help our people own up to how systems of institutional oppression work, because yes, we have our own sorrows, but that doesn't mean that we do not benefit from these systems. The statistics are firm and clear. If you are white and you go to the bank for a mortgage, you are more likely to get that mortgage and at a fair interest rate. And if you are stopped by the police officer for speeding, you will most likely get a warning rather than a fine. Systemic race privilege means that if you are white and your teenage son who is your very heart, if your teenage son who is your very heart goes off to the convenience store for some Skittles and a Mountain Dew, or maybe for some cigars, you are going to see your son come home alive from that walk to the neighborhood convenience store. Teaching these things in majority white churches and leading our people to spiritual insight and a change of heart on these matters might be hard, but here is where the Apostle Paul, in his letter to the Philippians, throws us the lifeline. Because reading Philippians in the context of Ferguson and question of white privilege, I now see Paul is not being arrogant here. He is not exhibiting an improper lack of humility. Listen. If anyone has reason to be confident in the flesh, I have more. Member of the people Israel, tribe of Benjamin, Hebrew born of Hebrews. And then read on, whatever gains I had, these I have come to regard as loss because of Christ. What the Apostle Paul is doing here, and it reads so straightforwardly relevant here that it almost feels as if he is doing it just for us in this very time. What the Apostle Paul is doing here is naming his ethnic privilege, his privilege accorded to the flesh, tribe of Benjamin, Hebrew born of Hebrews, and then he is setting it down, casting it aside for the cross. I regard everything as loss because of Christ, because of the surpassing value of knowing Christ Jesus, my Lord. For his sake, I have suffered the loss of all things. Paul offers us a model of how to think of ethnic privilege, and by analogy, other privileges that accrue to us here in this room. Now is not the time to assume false humility. Privilege? I don't have privilege. No, now is the time to name it and to help others name it, to own it, and to realize all we get from it, and then to set it down, to enter into relationship with those who carry the cross, all for the sake of Christ. Surely here our brother Paul offers us a way forward in those conversations we need to have in these times. Surely as we come forward in a few minutes to partake of the bread and cup, part of what we are invited to do is to name the privileges we have in a clear-eyed way, and then to set them down in order to participate fully in Christ's body. One last point. Sorry, I know I could go on. I just want to say that we who are teachers of Bible here at Brite Divinity, and not just the Brite Bible faculty, but all of us who teach Bible, hope to equip you with many tools in your biblical exegesis in order for you to tap into the Scripture's potential to unleash human flourishing while avoiding its potentially toxic effects. We're able to equip you with some very sophisticated exegetical tools, teaching you to read against the grain, to approach the text with the hermeneutics of suspicion. We can teach you, in the words of the African-American biblical scholar Aubrey Hendricks, to engage in guerrilla exegesis, to look for the gaps and fissures in the text and to pull out the non-dominant voices so that the most marginalized can speak. Or we can pull in extra-canonical writings, other voices that didn't make it into the canon, offering us new perspectives. Those of you who take courses with me know that I'm always doing this. Read the Gospel of Mary. It's not in the canon, but it's important. But on this particular point of confronting our ethnic privilege, and by analogy other privileges that accrue, of naming it and setting it aside to come to the table, I am not having to bring out those more sophisticated exegetical tools that sit in our toolbox. Here, in order to bring this message, all I am doing is being a lectionary preacher, offering up a straightforward, what might be called a plain sense reading of the Apostle Paul's letter to the Philippians. We might worry that having these conversations in our Christian churches will be difficult, but really, should it be all that hard?